So in the last maybe 8 years, things have shifted a bit in the kinds of pastoral conversations that I have, especially in the last 5 years. It's nice to be, I'm almost coming up to my 19th anniversary of my ordination. So it's nice to have a long enough history to see trajectories of themes that come and go throughout time. So the most frequent pastoral conversation I've had this theme in the always begins something like this. I have some baggage from how I was brought up in Christianity. Common way that pastoral conversations start, and digging a little deeper, because what that baggage looks like is different for everyone. Digging a little deeper, the conversations go in directions like this. Really stunts my ability to have a healthy relationship. Or something like, the way I was brought up and the way that my parents vote. Or I was and then fill in the blank with whatever that particular thing was for that person. I think that the most important follow Christ right now in this political environment, in of all that's happening with white Christian nationalism, as more clergy abuse scandals get uncovered, the most important work for us to do is to figure out how not to pass on what we've been given. It's the most important work for us to do, not pass on what we've been given. If you're around for any time here at the church, you'll know the theme in my preaching. Not pass on parts of what we've been given that aren't healthy or aren't workable. So we need to do things different before us. So the junk stops with us. Now, I know that each of you have your particular version of whatever that junk is. So I don't want to make sweeping statements because of different junk. But whatever that junk is, it needs to stop with us, so that the generations that follow us by what. So this feels new to me, as I said. Like in my 19 years of pastoral, like the last 5 years or so. Like I didn't hear my parents talk about, or that works in the retirement with senior adults. I didn't hear them talk about needing to do things differently than their parents as a bigger theme. The moment feels different, like there's something specific that's happening right now. So, as I often do, I laughed out loud. Let the text for today work for me. I laughed out loud when I heard myself summarize Moses' teaching in the book of Deuteronomy this way. Your parents messed this up, do better. Huh. Maybe we're not that unique after all. Maybe this is true of centuries that generations need to do things differently than the ones before them. So again, I would sum up actually the entire book of Deuteronomy, which is a lot. It's not just the that's a lot. The whole book is a lot. But it could really be summed up this way. Your parents messed up. You need to do better. So let's just jump right in to our text for today from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. These are very famous words that are often repeated in Judaism. So let's read. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So after the Exodus, remember we talked about the Exodus last week. We're jumping ahead another whole bunch of years. After the Exodus, the Israelite people left Egypt and were freed from slavery. They wandered in the desert for 40 years, struggling in their relationship with God. Out. So the people that Moses is speaking to now are 40 years later people. They're the people who came, the children of the people who left Egypt. And they hadn't been around yet when God led them through the dry land. Remember, the sea split and they walked through the dry land, and then the sea crashed down on the horse riders. And now I have that song in my head again, if you were here last week. They were the children of the people who loved that. And they were the children of the people who had messed things up. They were the children of the people in the desert for 40 years before God could fulfill God's promise to have them enter the promise. So these children are the ones that will receive the fulfillment of the promise to the parents. That's the told of the promised land, and Moses is giving them his parting instructions because he knows he's with them because he kind of messed up too along the way. So he's giving them this final speech, like final speech I give my kids before they leave in the morning, to things remember after school Moses is doing. So in the course of the book of Deuteronomy, right before this, Moses had reminded them of the 10 Commandments, which their parents had been given just outside of Egypt. He reminded them of the 10 Commandments. He says this, which has become a very important prayer called the Shema. So again, this is kind of like the summation of the 10 Commandments. It's like, if you know one thing about this, remember this. So here's Deuteronomy 6 again. I want you to notice the verbs. What are the verbs? So a verb is an action word. What are the verbs? When you hear one, let's just raise your hand when you hear one, okay? This is, don't worry, I won't judge you. But when you hear one, just raise your hand. All right. Hear, O Israel, good job. The Lord is God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Good job. So these are not only verbs, these are all command verbs. It's called an imperative form of the verb. They're very directive about what they are. Hear, cite, talk, bind, fix, write. These are all commands. And all of them refer back to love God. That's what they're supposed to keep. Those are the words they're supposed to keep. That is what they're supposed to recite. That is supposed to be what they talk about. That is supposed to be what they bind on their hands and on their forehead. That's supposed to be what they write on their house. This reminder to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Love the Lord your God. What does it mean to love God? I mean, this is the crux of it all. This is what the Hebrew people got messed up in the 40 years of wandering in the desert, and many times since then. This is the thing that many of us experienced, the generation before us getting wrong, is what does it mean to love? What does it mean to love God? Generations of people got really into the words of the Shema. And actually have rituals in the morning and in the evening of saying these words, reciting the Shema. They actually recite them to their children and talk about them. They have rituals oriented around the Shema. So have you heard of these? It's called phylacteries. They actually literally make a little box and put God's word in the little box, and actually wrap it around their hands when they pray. And there's another one that they wrap around their head with leather straps. Actually, literally them, and they actually have these little things. I think it's called a mezuzah. That is like a little compartment. Scroll in with God's words on it, of the Lord your God, and they put a little scroll in the mezuzah, and every time they go in or out their front door. Is that loving God? To love God is to keep the commandments. Well, yes, but also no. Yes, loving God is keeping the commandments. Now I'm talking broader, the broad commandments, like the 10 Commandments. People, if you think about what the 10 Commandments are about, don't lie, don't give allegiance to different things on different days, like stick with God. People who live a life of well-ordered love lead to murder. So yes, according to God's commandments is a sign of love for God. But it is not the thing itself. It is not the thing itself. The thing itself leads to, if we think about following the laws as the thing itself, we get into legalism, which we all have experienced at some point in our life if you've been around for maybe 30 years or more. And it shows with the Hebrew people getting obsessed with following 613 laws. Like the 10 Commandments was just kind of the start of it. And then they have a book of laws that was 613 laws. And there's a very large community, even today, in Judaism that orders their lives around these 613 laws. And we see it in Christianity, legalism. The idea is that to be a Christian, you must. To be a Christian, how it's looked in my life, you must be part of a certain political party. To be a Christian, you must keep your sexuality in these very narrow ways. To be a Christian, you must not swear. To be a Christian, you must masculinity or femininity in very specific boundaries. You must church, in every Sunday, but it wasn't only Sunday mornings for me, it was also Sunday evenings and Wednesday evenings. These were all things that we needed to do if we wanted to be a Christian. But here's the thing, none of this actually helped us to love God. Not commandments alone are a way to love God. So what does it mean to love God? I asked that question again. I thought about this quite a bit. Is it some kind of affection? When I say to my kids, I love you, or my husband, I love you, is it some kind of affection for God? And if I'm that, I don't toward God. So that might be part of it for some people, but I don't think that captures the whole of it. Because at the core of all these commandments is to love. Remember, way back to Abraham, what God said to Abraham when God called him and said, I'm going to set you apart. Abraham was blessed. Why? To be a blessing. that's what the core of the relationship with God was for Abraham. He was blessed, a blessing. I think that this is the basic foundation of how we love God. This verse, Jesus had a lot to say. Well, the Shema was a central part of Jesus' life because Jesus was obviously a Jew. The words of the Shema would have been central to his daily activities as well. So when we listen to how Jesus talked about how do and loving God work together. So let's read Jesus' words from Matthew verses 34 through 40. So the Pharisees, we're going to meet the Pharisees and the Sadducees in this text, and those are different groups of Jews who had very strict ways of following the law as an expression of loving God. So when the Pharisees heard that he being Jesus, silenced the gathered together, asked him a question to test him. Teach, which in the law is the greatest? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. Does this sound familiar? These are the words of the Shema. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. And this is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So when important about being faithful to the law, Jesus said, love God and love God. These two things are not separate. These two things are the same. And things are the basis of all of the laws and all of the words and actions of the prophet. To love God and to love your neighbor are the same, have the same weight. They are close together, they are touching each other. Could it be that neighbor is love of God? Does that fit? Was blessed to be a blessing. Fit with the words of the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, to use Jesus' words. Does that fit? Your neighbor is to love God. To love your neighbor is to love God. I mean, have you ever met God in the face of your neighbor? You experience your neighbor as a helper, or when you experience your neighbor as a real human being, or when you're able to share a break with your literal neighbor, or someone at work or a friend, or have you ever met God in the face of another person? The people who volunteer for neighbors will tell you that they meet God in the face of those neighbors every single time. If we love our neighbor, we are so loving. It's like a relief to me, because I don't know what it means to love God. How do you love something, someone that's intangible and as big as the universe? How do you love God? But I know how to love my neighbor. I don't always, but I know how to love my neighbor. So what if that were true? What if it's true that loving your neighbor is loving God? How would that change what we pass on to the next generation? How would that change how you live your spiritual life or your religious life? Change what happens when you go out of here, when you actually open those doors, the car, and deal with humanity again. How would that if love of God is love of neighbor, if hatred is turning your back on God, how would that change how you act? How would that change the world if to love God is to love your neighbor? So let's play with this a little bit, and to close, I want to start with combining Jesus' use of Shema with Moses' words in the Shema. So I'm gonna read it again. Be on the screen. You can follow along. I'm gonna add actually Jesus' words in here. And for the last part, with all of keep these words, all of the verbs, the imperative verbs. Imagine what Moses is talking about, to be love of neighbor. All right, here we go. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. Keep words, love your neighbor as you love yourself, that I am commanding in your heart. Recite these words, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Recite them to your children, talk about them when you are at home, and remind your children when you are away, when you lie down, and when you rise. Love your neighbor as yourself. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them, love your neighbor as you love yourself, on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Mean for you to love your neighbor, and go and do that thing. Let's pray. God, thank you for the huge scope of the history of humanity that we find ourselves in. That there is, so to speak, nothing new under the sun. Even as we struggle to end some of the harmful things that the previous generation has given to us in order to pass on less, is a task that has been done over and over and over again. Thank you for Moses and for his complicated task of leading the Hebrew people through this time. Thank you for Moses' quirks and gifts, triumphs, to take the pressure off us to do it right all the time. Help us to rest in we don't have to get it all right. That your love doesn't rely on our perfection. That your love rely on us being faithful all the time. But just help us to do one thing, one new thing, one different thing as we go from here, to love our neighbor well, and in so doing, to love you well. In your name, amen.